All right, diving in today, folks, we're going to tackle something that's probably, I'd bet, kept a few of you up at night, tossing and turning that age-old question of knowing how versus knowing that.
Two sides of the same coin, you might say. Or are they? That's what we're here to unpack.
Exactly. We've got these excerpts from, the good old Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and they really get into the nitty-gritty of this debate, which, by the way, has been going on in analytic philosophy for, well, quite a while.
A real head-scratcher. But hey, it's not just some ivory tower puzzle.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, this gets to the core of, what does it even mean to be intelligent, to have a skill?
Right?
Even how we use language gets tangled up in this.
It does. It really does. It's a rabbit hole for sure.
So for all you philosophy fans out there, today's mission, should we choose to accept it, is to make this whole thing, well, a bit less tangled.
Yeah.
Break it down, see what each side's saying, and figure out what it all means for, what does it even mean to know something in the first place?
We're going to give you the lay of the land, the arguments, the big players, the whole shebang.
Okay, great. So before we get lost in the weeds, let's set the stage right. Philosophy loves its distinctions. And when it comes to knowledge, well, there are a few. There's that basic kind, like knowing a person or a place, acquaintance knowledge. Think of, your childhood home, right?
Familiar territory.
Exactly. Then there's knowing that something is true, like the earth goes around the sun, that kind of thing. Propositional knowledge, the philosophers call it.
Right.
But the star of our show today is that knowing how to ride a bike, how to play an instrument, how to, bake the perfect souffle.
The stuff we actually do in the world.
Right. And it was this guy, Gilbert Ryle, who really threw a wrench in the works back in, 1949?
Yep, with his book, The Concept of Mind, he really shook things up.
He did. He basically said, hey, this whole idea that knowing how to do something is just a fancy way of knowing a bunch of facts, it's a myth. He called it the intellectualist legend. Knowing how to swing a baseball bat isn't just having a mental list of step 1, grip the bat, step 2, lift your arms,
A recipe for action, basically.
Right, exactly. But Ryle, he was a hardcore anti-intellectualist. He was like, nope, knowing how and knowing that, those are two totally different animals.
Yeah.
And, his view really stuck around for a while, influencing all sorts of fields.
Psychologists, neuroscientists, everyone was paying attention.
They were. But here's the thing. The debate didn't die. It's actually having a revival these days. Philosophers are back at it, arguing both sides, getting really sophisticated with it.
Round 2, you could say. And it gets pretty heated sometimes.
Oh, for sure. And it's not just about, are these different types of knowledge, right? It's also about what's happening in our heads. What kind of mental state is knowing how? Is it a belief, a feeling, some special power? Who knows?
The mind is a mysterious place.
It is. Okay, so let's get into the meat of it. Let's start with those arguments against this whole intellectualist idea, that knowing how is just knowing facts. And the big one, the heavyweight champion, is the regress argument.
Ah, yes, the regress. This one's a classic. Ryle was a clever guy, and he basically argued that if you try to explain knowing how in terms of knowing that, you end up in a never-ending loop.
Like one of those mirrors facing each other, just going on forever.
Exactly. You get stuck. You can't get out. Ryle said it best, I think. If for any operation to be intelligently executed, a prior theoretical operation had first to be performed and performed intelligently, it would be a logical impossibility for anyone ever to break into the circle.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty clear, I guess. But how does this actually play out in the argument against intellectualism? Give us the breakdown.
So one way to understand this is through something called the contemplation argument. It starts with a pretty basic idea. If you're going to use your knowledge that something's true, you got to first think about it, contemplate it. Right?
But yeah, makes sense.
Now, let's say you buy into strong intellectualism, which is the view that knowing how is basically just knowing a certain proposition. And then you add in this action premise, which says that doing anything means using your know-how. Right. Well, you see where this is going.
Maybe. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is.
Yeah.
Picture this. You're making a cup of tea. Simple enough, right? But according to this action premise, you're using your know-how to do it. But remember, we're saying knowing how is just knowing a proposition. So to use that knowledge to make the tea, you first got to contemplate that proposition. Think it through, consciously.
All right, so far so good. I think.
But hold on, that act of contemplating, of thinking, that's an action too, isn't it? So to
Yeah.
contemplate that proposition, you got to use your know-how to contemplate. And if that know-how is also just another proposition, well, guess what? You got to contemplate that one before you can even contemplate the first one, and down the rabbit hole we go.
Oh, I see. It's like you need to know how to think before you can think about how to make tea. But to know how to think, you need to think about how to think about thinking, and it just never ends.
Exactly. It's an infinite regress. You'd never actually get around to making the tea because you'd be stuck in this endless chain of contemplation.
So that's pretty absurd. But I feel like someone's got to have an objection to this, right? Philosophers love to poke holes in arguments.
They do, and they have. Some argue that, well, maybe this action premise only really applies to actions you do on purpose, intentionally. Like if you trip and fall, you're not exactly using your knowledge of, how to fall gracefully, are you?
Yeah, that's true. I definitely don't have that knowledge.
So if we limit this to intentional actions, maybe we can avoid the regress by saying that contemplating a proposition, well, that doesn't have to be intentional. It can just kind of happen, no need for prior know-how to kick it off.
Like a reflex, almost. You see a red light while driving, you know you need to stop, and boom, you hit the brakes without really thinking about it.
Exactly. So if contemplation can be like that, non-intentional, then it's not the kind of action that needs know-how. And the regress, well, it stops. Of course, some hardcore intellectualists might still say, but wait, what if there's this unconscious, intentional contemplation going on, even when we're not aware of it? But then they got to prove that, right?
Burden of proof and all that.
Yeah.
What about the other premise in this argument, the contemplation premise? The one that says you always got to consciously think about a proposition before acting on it.
Well, there's this philosopher, Carl Jennett, who gave us a good counterexample. He talks about doors. You might know that to open a door, you got to turn the knob and push. But you don't go around thinking, turn the knob, push the door every time you leave a room, right? It's automatic. You just do it.
Yeah, that's true. I'd be pretty exhausted if I had to think through every little action like that.
Right. So Jennett's point is that Ryle might not have disproven intellectualism entirely. Maybe he was just showing us that knowing something and actually using that knowledge, well, those are two different things. You can act on knowledge without always having to consciously think about it. And some think that might have been Ryle's main point all along, to highlight that difference between knowing and doing.
Interesting. So the contemplation argument, while kind of trippy, maybe doesn't completely demolish the intellectualist position. But they're not out of the woods yet, are they? There are other ways to set up this regress challenge. What about this employment regress? How does that one work?
All right, so the employment regress, it shifts the focus from just contemplation to the actual using of knowledge. Instead of the contemplation premise, we've got the employment premise. This says that to use your knowledge that something's true, you also need to use some know-how. And they're saying these two things, the knowing that and the knowing how to use it, those are different.
Okay, I can kind of see the potential for a loop here. So if using knowledge, that always means using some knowledge how, and if that knowledge how is itself just another bit of knowledge, which is what strong intellectualists say, then we're back in that infinite loop, right? Needing know-how to use know that, which needs more know-how, and on and on.
You got it. It's a vicious cycle. But just like with the contemplation argument, intellectualists have some comebacks. They might say that using knowledge that something's true isn't always an action that needs prior know-how. Maybe it's a simpler mental function, like almost a reflex.
Interesting. So are they saying that knowledge that, like, facts are just kind of sitting there passively until some know-how comes along and flips the switch?
In a way, yes. But many intellectualists would actually push back against that picture. They'd say knowledge itself already has this kind of action-guiding quality built in. It's not just sitting there inert, waiting to be activated. Yeah. And there's another interesting point here. Some have pointed out that if we consider using know-how that to be an action that needs know-how, well, then using know-how might also need know-how. So maybe the anti-intellectualists are in the same boat, stuck in their own regress. It's a double-edged sword.
I see. Turning the tables, huh? So it seems like these regress arguments, while they definitely raise some tough questions, well, they're not quite slam dunks. They rely on some pretty tricky assumptions. Now, the excerpts also mention a sort of revival of the regress argument, focusing on this idea of intelligent performance. How is that different from the original version?
So this newer take on the regress, it widens the scope. It's not just about deliberate actions anymore. It's about anything you do that shows intelligence, whether you meant to do it that way or not, even stuff that's happening inside your head, like understanding a concept. The key here is this intelligent performance premise. This says that if you do something intelligently, if it shows know-how, then that means there's some underlying knowledge how there.
So, like, even if I'm not trying to be clever, if what I do shows some sort of competence, then it reveals I know how to do it on some level.
Precisely. Now, here's where the trouble starts. Sometimes just expressing what you know that something's true, well, that can be an intelligent thing to do. Like you're facing a moral dilemma and you got to choose the right principle to apply. It's intelligence, right?
Yeah, making a wise decision. That's definitely intelligent.
It is. But if doing that intelligently needs know-how, and if intellectualism's true, meaning that know-how is just another piece of knowledge that, well, then that propositional knowledge also needs to be manifested. And if that manifestation is intelligent, even if it's not a conscious choice, it seems like you need even more know-how, and boom, the regress is back.
Okay, I'm starting to get a headache. It's like those Russian nesting dolls, one inside the other, forever. But I'm guessing the intellectualists have a way to deal with this, right? They always seem to have an answer up their sleeve.
They do. They're slippery, those intellectualists. Their trick here is to make a distinction between what it means for knowledge to be manifested intelligently.
Manifested intelligently. That's a mouthful.
It is, but stay with me. They're saying there are two ways your actions can be intelligent in relation to your knowledge. One is when your actions are like directly guided by your know-how. Think of a surgeon, carefully operating. Every move is informed by their knowledge of how to do surgery.
Right, makes sense.
The other way, though, is what they call epistemic manifestation. This is when your action just shows you have know-how, even if you weren't consciously using it in that moment. Like when you catch something that's falling without even thinking about it.
Oh, like a reflex, again. But that still shows I know how to catch, even if I wasn't really thinking about it.
Precisely. So the intellectualists are saying that the regress only pops up if we assume that every time propositional knowledge is used intelligently, it's got to be in that first guided way. But sometimes it's just epistemic. It shows you have the knowledge, but it's not causing a problematic loop. Like checking your blind spot when driving that shows you know how to drive safely, but you're not consciously thinking, I know how to check my blind spot every time you turn your head.
Right. That makes sense. It's like the knowledge is there, it's influencing my actions, but it's not like causing a never-ending mental spiral.
Exactly. So they've neatly sidestepped the regress in those cases.
Clever. Very clever. Okay, so there's one more regress argument we got to tackle. And this one, it's a bit of an oddball. It involves Lewis Carroll, the guy who wrote Alice in Wonderland. What's that all about?
Ah, yes. Lewis Carroll's regress. This one's a bit less famous, but it's pretty interesting. It zooms in on this basic human ability, understanding and applying rules of logic. Imagine a student who gets the premises of an argument. They get the conclusion, but they just don't see the connection. Why does that conclusion follow from those premises? They're missing something.
Like, they know the ingredients but can't bake the cake.
Exactly. So the teacher, trying to help, says, okay, here's the rule of inference that connects them. Another proposition to be understood, right. But even after understanding this new rule, the student still doesn't get it. They can't apply it. The teacher might then offer another, even more basic rule, and so on and so forth.
It sounds like trying to fill a hole with more and more dirt, but the hole's the wrong shape. You need something else entirely.
Exactly. Ryle's point here is that knowing a rule of logic, truly grasping it, isn't just about knowing more propositions, more rules. It's about having an ability. The ability to make those logical jumps. In his words, knowing a rule is knowing how. It's something you do, not just something you know.
Okay. I see what he's getting at. But how do the intellectualists respond to this? If knowing how isn't just knowing that their whole position kind of falls apart, right?
Well, they've got some moves left. One response, and you hear this a lot from intellectualist Jason Stanley, is that maybe the student in Carroll's example doesn't really understand the premises to begin with. Like, if understanding a premise that involves a conditional statement already means being able to make inferences from it, then maybe the student isn't fully grasping the meaning of those premises.
Okay, so they're saying the problem isn't with the rules of inference, it's with how the student's understanding the starting point.
Right. Of course, this gets into a whole debate about the nature of meaning itself, what it means to understand something. But other intellectualists might say that the student just isn't representing the rule of inference in a way that connects to action, Or maybe they're just not seeing how the general rule applies to this specific case. It's like they're missing the bridge between the abstract and the concrete.
So, lots of ways to spin it. It seems like those regress arguments are tricky, but the intellectualists aren't giving up without a fight. They're like philosophical ninjas, always finding a way to deflect the attack. All right, let's move on to another classic anti-intellectualist argument, the sufficiency argument. This one sounds pretty straightforward.
It is, at least on the surface. The basic idea is that knowing all the facts about something doesn't automatically mean you know how to do it. Ryle put it this way: how can simply telling a stupid player all the truths about a game magically turn them into a clever player?
It's like knowing all the ingredients doesn't make you a chef.
Right.
You can read every cookbook, memorize every recipe, and still burn water.
Exactly. A classic example is the good old swimming problem. I could watch expert swimmers, have a coach explain every little movement, even know the exact sequence of movements that make you swim, but if you throw me in the deep end, I'm probably going down. I know that that's how you swim, but I don't know how to do it myself.
Yeah, no amount of theoretical knowledge is going to save me from drowning if I can't actually coordinate my limbs. So, this seems like a pretty strong point against the idea that knowing how is just knowing that. How do the intellectualists try to wiggle out of this one?
Their main tool here is this idea of practical modes of presentation. They're saying that just knowing a fact by observing it or being told about it, that's not the same as knowing it in a practical way. Knowing how, for them, means knowing a proposition, but in a special way that's tied to your ability to act. So in the swimming example, what I'm missing, even after all the explanations, is this practical knowledge of how I can move my body in the water.
So it's not just about knowing that moving your arms and legs this way makes you swim. It's about knowing that in a way that's connected to my own body and my ability to actually move those arms and legs.
Exactly. It's a subtle difference, but they say it's crucial.
Okay. But I'm sensing a but coming. These practical modes of presentation, they seem kind of fishy to me. Like, how do you even define that?
You're right to be suspicious. A lot of philosophers are. They say this whole concept is too vague, too hand-wavy. And some even accuse the intellectualists of circular reasoning here. Like, they're saying you know how to do it because you know that you can do it, but in a way that only someone who already knows how to do it would know.
Yeah, that's not very helpful.
Yeah.
It's like saying you can ride a bike because you have the knowledge of how to ride a bike, which you only get by knowing how to ride a bike. Where's the explanation?
Exactly. That's why some intellectualists have tried to come up with alternative explanations that don't rely on these mysterious practical modes. For example, Jason Stanley, he points out that words like could are tricky. That's how you could swim. That can mean different things depending on the context.
Like right now, I could technically swim, I guess, meaning I have the physical capacity. But I could swim if I took some lessons, meaning I'd have the skill then.
Precisely. And Stanley's saying, knowing the second could doesn't mean you actually know how to swim now. You need a different kind of knowledge, one that's about your current capabilities.
Okay, I kind of see where he's going with that. But what about that thought experiment with Mary, the one who loses her memory of how to swim? She might still be physically capable, but if she's forgotten how to do it, she doesn't know how to swim, right? Even if you show her a video of herself swimming and say, look, that's how you can swim given your current physical condition, she's not suddenly going to be able to jump in the pool and do it.
Excellent point. This kind of example really pushes the intellectualists to either clarify those practical modes of presentation or find a whole new way to explain how knowing facts can translate into actual ability. And that's where Carlotta Pavese comes in. She tries to make this whole practical mode thing a bit more concrete by comparing it to computer programs.
Computer programs. Okay, this should be good.
Bear with me. So, a program takes an input and produces an output, right? Like a set of instructions. Pavese says practical modes of presentation are kind of like that. They break down complex actions into smaller, simpler steps that you can actually execute.
So it's like having a mental program for action. Instead of lines of code, it's, I don't know, practical knowledge chunks or something.
Yeah, something like that. And the idea is that having this practical representation of the task already implies having the ability to perform those basic steps.
Interesting. It's like a recipe that you can actually follow, not just one you've memorized but can't use. But this whole idea of practical concepts, it's not just about knowing how, right? It's popping up in other areas of philosophy too.
Absolutely. It's become a hot topic in discussions of action, intention, even how our minds connect to our bodies. There's even empirical research going on trying to find evidence for these practical concepts in the brain. But of course, not everyone buys it. Some still think we can get by without these fancy modes of presentation, maybe by focusing on different ways of knowing a proposition.
So the intellectualists are getting creative, constantly refining their arguments, trying to find ways to make their view fit with these really strong intuitions we have about the difference between knowing that and knowing how. All right, let's tackle the last of the classic anti-intellectualist arguments, the gradability argument. This one seems pretty intuitive.
It is. Ryle noticed that we often talk about knowing how to do something in part or better. Like, I might kind of know how to play the piano, but with practice I'll get better. But it sounds weird to say you know a fact in part. Either you know Paris is the capital of France or you don't. There's no in between.
Yeah, exactly. You can't be partially right about historical facts, but you can definitely gradually improve at baking bread or writing code or playing chess. It's a process.
Right. And philosophers have pointed out that Ryle's actually making two related points here. The gradability of how we talk about knowing how we say someone's good or bad at something, and the gradability of the knowledge itself, which grows as you learn. Some even argue that this gradability makes knowing how more like acquaintance knowledge.
Yeah.
You can know someone well, or kind of well. It comes in degrees.
Okay, so the main point here is that knowing how can be possessed in degrees, which doesn't really fit with the all-or-nothing nature of propositional knowledge. Facts. You either know them or you don't.
Right. But as you might expect, Carlotta Pavis has something to say about this. She steps in and says, hold on, there are actually two types of gradability when it comes to knowing how.
Two types. Go on.
She says there's quantitative gradability, knowing how to do something partially versus completely. And then there's qualitative gradability, knowing how to do something better or worse than someone else. And her point is that these same types of gradability actually show up in other kinds of knowledge that intellectualists usually consider propositional.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Think about knowing who came to a party. You might remember some people, but not everyone. That's quantitative, right? You only know part of the answer.
Yeah, okay.
And then you might know a better answer than someone else who only remembers a few people. That's qualitative. And knowing who came to the party, that's ultimately about knowing a bunch of propositions, right? One for each person who was there.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So she's saying that even though those cases seem gradable, they're still about propositional knowledge. Clever.
Very clever. And by analogy, she says when we say someone knows how to play a song in part, maybe they just know some of the propositional steps involved. And as for learning how gradually, well, if knowing how is about knowing this complex practical answer, then learning gradually just means gradually learning the parts of that answer.
Okay, so the intellectualists are arguing that gradability isn't a deal breaker for their view. They're finding ways to fit it into their framework. All right, let's switch gears now and look at the arguments for intellectualism. And the one that gets a lot of attention is the linguistic argument.
Ah, yes, the linguists have entered the chat.
They have. This argument focuses on how we use language, specifically on how the phrase knows how looks a lot like other phrases that clearly involve knowing a proposition, like knows where, knows who, knows what, and even knows what to do. They all seem to follow the same grammatical pattern.
Pattern recognition, a classic philosophical move.
It is. So they're basically saying, hey, look, Mary knows how to bake a cake. Sounds just like Mary knows where the flour is. They both have this question word in them, a we word.
A we question lurking within, hinting at a propositional answer.
Right. So the linguistic argument goes like this, in 3 steps. First, they say the logical structure of knowing how is the same as knowing plus some question. Second, they say that when you know plus a question, what you really know is the proposition that answers that question. And finally, they apply that to knowing how, saying it means knowing the answer to the question, how can one do X?
3 steps to intellectualism, just like a recipe.
Exactly. So they're treating how to just like any other question word, implying that what you know is ultimately a proposition, a fact.
A fact dressed up in a how costume.
Right. Now, to get a bit more specific, intellectualists often say that knowing how to do X means knowing the answer to the question, how could I myself do X? They emphasize this dissay aspect, meaning it's about how you specifically can do it, not just anyone.
It's personal, this knowing how, not just some general knowledge, but knowledge about your own capabilities.
Right. And of course, they bring back those practical modes of presentation here, don't they? Saying you need to know this proposition, the answer to how could I do X, in a way that's connected to your actual ability.
Oh, absolutely. They can't seem to let go of those practical modes. It's like their security blanket.
Well, it's a comfy blanket, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the gist of the linguistic argument. But as with any good philosophical argument, there are objections, and our sources helpfully group them into 3 categories. Let's tackle the first one.
All right, so the first group, they're basically saying, hold your horses, language isn't everything. They're arguing that just because knows how sounds like those other knows phrases, it doesn't mean the underlying mental states are the same. We got to look at the psychology, the cognitive science, not just the grammar.
Oh, it's like just because we use the same word for love, in different contexts, like love for pizza and love for your partner, doesn't mean those are the same kind of feeling, right?
Precisely. Language can be slippery. But, as our sources point out, this doesn't completely invalidate the linguistic evidence. Think about beliefs and desires. We talk about them using propositions all the time, like, I believe that it's raining, or I desire that I had $1,000,000. In this way of talking, it actually fits pretty well with how we explain and predict behavior in everyday life. So maybe language can tell us something about the mind, even if it's not the whole story.
Fair enough.
Huh?
It's like we shouldn't ignore the grammar, but we shouldn't rely on it entirely either.
Right. The best theory is going to fit with both how we talk and what we know about the brain.
Makes sense. What about the second group of objections? What are they nitpicking about?
All right, this group is more focused on truth conditions. They're saying that the way intellectualists analyze knows how, it doesn't quite capture when those statements are actually true or false. Some argue that knowing how is about the action itself, not a proposition about the action, like she knows the act of swimming, rather than she knows that moving her limbs this way makes her swim. But intellectualists can counter this by saying, well, maybe knowing how to swim is about having a certain attitude towards the act of swimming, and you get that attitude by knowing a proposition about how to swim.
It's like you know how to swim because you have this practical knowledge of how to swim. It's still propositional, just, practical.
Right. But then there's this other problem. Are those complements of verbs like knows which and knows where always actually questions? This substitution problem shows this. You can know a question without knowing the answer. Like I can know the question, who left the party early, without knowing who actually left. Even if the answer is John left early, knowing that proposition doesn't automatically mean I know the answer to the question.
Yeah, that's tricky. So knowing a question and knowing its answer, those aren't always the same thing. What do the intellectualists say to that?
They say, aha, tricky wording. They argue that words like discovered or learned are ambiguous. Sometimes they're about objects like, I discovered a new planet. But sometimes they're about propositions. I discovered that Pluto isn't a planet anymore. They say there's a subtle difference there.
A linguistic sleight of hand, perhaps?
Maybe. And they point to languages like German, which have two different words for knowing. Kennen, for knowing a person or place, and wissen, for knowing a fact. So they're saying, hey, language itself supports this distinction.
All right, so language is on their side, they say. What other linguistic loopholes are they exploiting?
Well, there's this whole group of philosophers called objectualists who say that the how-to part of knows how isn't a question at all. It's more like a noun phrase that refers to a way of doing something. They point out that you can say, I know how to bake a cake, or I know a way to bake a cake, and those seem pretty much equivalent.
Yeah, I can see that. Knowing how and knowing a way, those sound pretty similar. And this also fits with the gradability thing, right? We can know a city well or partially, and we can know how to do something well or partially. It's like we're talking about an object of knowledge, a way of doing things, not just a proposition.
Exactly. And some have even suggested that how-to functions like a special kind of clause called a free relative clause, which refers to a thing or a way of doing something, not a proposition.
Okay, so lots of linguistic gymnastics going on here. I'm guessing the intellectualists have a countermove.
Oh, they always do. They point out that knows how passes certain grammatical tests that free relative clauses usually fail. Like, you can say, she knows how to.